The challenge with incomplete requirements going into a model when it's building a software system is that ambiguity at a minimum becomes some sort of hallucinated feature that the model has made up and potentially becomes masses of rework and wasted tokens and ultimately real kind of code smell in the repository as well. So the ultimate artifact winds up harmed as well. And so I think of it as almost like context engineering on steroids for software projects and making sure that the model is as well as possible grounded in the what that it's building. Being able to give that steer, not in a one-shot prompt, but in some documentation. That's where I see Spec-Driven and BMAD being really, really strong.
What does BMAD mean to you?
Build more, architect dream. It's this really interesting open source project. What it's about is giving a model the best context possible to go and autonomously build software.
Before we jump into this episode, I wanted to let you know that this podcast is for developers building with AI at the core. So whether that's exploring the latest tools, the workflows, or the best practices, this podcast's for you. A really quick ask, 90% of people who are listening to this haven't yet subscribed. So if this content has helped you build smarter, hit that subscribe button and maybe a like. All right, back to the episode. Hello and welcome to another episode of the AI Native Dev. My name is Simon Maple and I'm your host for this episode. And today we're going to have a really fun chat about something called BMAD and the BMAD method. So this is, I believe it's called a Build More Architect Dream, which is a fun way of really talking about a spec-driven approach to building software, where we really think about specifications first and then drive the code from there. It allows us to really think about how we create our intents versus thinking about the how too early. And we capture those behaviors and those constraints very, very early in the process. And taking us through this is Cian Clarke from Nearform. And Cian and I have done a couple of things, including actually we shared the stage at AI Native DevCon in New York in May, and we also did a meetup very recently as well in London. Cian, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm doing well.
Brilliant. And so you're head of AI at Nearform, right? Tell us a little bit about what that entails.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's really about realizing customers' ambitions in the world of AI. And more recently, of course, lots of generative AI. That's been something that's been keeping us pretty busy. And so that might look like, unearthing a bunch of proprietary knowledge that some customer might have in their product to their end customers. It might be, building some sort of agentic system to make their teams go faster. But of late, we've also been thinking an awful lot, not just about what we build in the space of AI, but also how we build it.
Yeah.
And so Nearform sort of came of age in the era of Node.js, and that's been sort of the technology we've been known for. And actually, we've been thinking a lot lately about AI native delivery and delivering with AI models and the enhanced capabilities of coding models and spec-driven. And so that's really brought our paths together, I suppose, since we are very interested in all of the tool sets and ways to build software artifacts through AI. So, more about the how we build as well as what we build with AI.
Which is super interesting because, there's a lot of obviously kind of consultancies and people like that who are really not adopting AI in a very interesting way. But you're really kind of leading a lot of the way with a very spec oriented and future thinking path of building with AI. So we'll explore some of this in just a second. Why don't we first talk a little bit about BMAD? What does BMAD mean to you?
Yeah, absolutely. So to me, it's sort of the best approximation we have right now of what a comprehensive spec-driven workflow looks like. And so it's, there's a sort of a tagline attached to BMAD of build more, architect dream, but it's also sort of named by the guy who created it, Brian Madsen, so BMAD. And it's this really interesting open source project, which I think is quite important to us at Nearform, since a lot of our pedigree comes from the world of open source and contributing upstream to things like Fastify and Node Core. And so, yeah, the fact that this is an open source framework that is also open to the selection of model vendor and open to the selection of IDE toolset as well is something that really, really appealed to us. And in my head, actually, at its very core, what it's about is just like really intelligent context engineering with a model. And that's kind of what Spec-Driven is all about, at least in my head, giving a model the best context possible to go and autonomously build software.
Right.
And it, as I say, best approximation I've seen to date of how to go about doing that.
And I didn't know that about the name, the BMAD. That's Brian Madison, is it?
That's it, yeah.
That's it.
Madsen, I think it's
Madsen, sorry, Madsen.
Yeah,
So it started as a name and it was searching for an acronym. That's that really.
I think so. Yeah, exactly. The acronym now is a bit of a stretch, I feel. But
now the build more
really,
architect dream makes a ton more sense. I was looking at that and thinking, wow, where did this come from? But now it all makes a lot more sense.
But it's a catchy name, yeah. And it started with this person, but there's a huge suite of contributors now on this tool set, and it's this really vibrant open source project that's gone through a couple of different versions. It's got a really cool, the V6 version that's just released has a bunch of really nice developments in terms of being able to select the scale of project you're working on. It's got a module system where you can bring your own roles. So it's really evolved massively over the last kind of couple of months.
Yeah. Let's get into that in a little bit. But I guess the one question that I'd love to ask, because I know Nearform, do a lot of work in kind of like the discovery of various, a lot of the research and discovery of various tools. I know you're big fans of Kiro, for example. I know we've talked in the past about using Tessl for discovering context and learning about how agents can be much better enabled. Where did you first learn about? How did you kind of like go through the discovery period with BMAD?
Yeah, so it sort of came out of our own internal discovery process, really. And we would do very frequently in consulting this kind of discovery process that we call Ignite, which is about aligning a bunch of stakeholders and what exactly it is that they want to build. And, in the world of consulting, we call this discovery, but like it happens in every company, basically a bunch of folk getting together and talking about what the requirements are for the thing they're looking to build, what's really important, like what levers within the business is it going to impact, and being able to document some of that stuff, really, really well. And we noticed that we could use things like AI note takers within the meeting to be able to capture a lot of that context and then distill it down into playback decks and also distill it down into requirements documents. And so it was the folk who were facilitating these sessions that observed that actually you can get really good requirements documentation and backlogs off the back of these meetings, just talking about how and what it is exactly that we want to build. And I know the folks in AWS do this a lot with their pre-read time in meetings when they're doing their peer FAQs. And now they've moved to this term called squad mobbing. So this is, a really big methodology in industry as well, this idea of gathering requirements as a group and then using that as an artifact to then later go and build. And so we kind of spotted, we had been vibe coding prototypes that we would later throw away, because that's what you tend to do with an artifact that's vibe coded. But actually, could we ground the process of using AI to develop with these artifacts? And that kind of aha moment happened probably about 6 months ago, and it wasn't me who had it. It's a member of my team, James, who helped out there and discovered this tool called BMAD along the way that is really, really good at taking some of that documentation and using it to hone the output of a model. And so I discovered this spec-driven thing, and as a pretty vibe coding skeptic, this was sort of a revelation for me, because all of a sudden you're actually able to steer what the model did. And that was pretty powerful, I think.
Yeah, and a lot of the things that you're kind of like talking about here, whether it's spec-driven or BMAD, they're really kind of like smart and I guess, they're solutions that are well thought out. But I guess when we go back to the root problem, what would you say is the need for these types of solutions?
Yeah, for me, it came down to forcing the world of vibe coding to sort of grow up a little bit and have some guardrails. And so to fill in that, uncertainty with where the model would fill in the gap, instead have stakeholders fill in the gap and make sure the requirements were actually complete. Because the challenge with incomplete requirements going into a model when it's building a software system is that ambiguity at a minimum becomes some sort of, hallucinated feature that the model has made up, and potentially becomes masses of rework and wasted tokens, and ultimately, real kind of code smell in the repository as well. So the ultimate artifact winds up kind of harmed as well. And so I kind of think of it as almost like context engineering on steroids for software projects, and making sure that the model is as well as possible grounded in the what that it's building, as well as the how you want it to build. Being able to give that steer, not in a one-shot prompt, but in some documentation. That's kind of where I see spec-driven and BMAD being really, really strong.
And what's really interesting here is kind of like when we think about what, the way BMAD goes around trying to solve this, and specs, if we think back well before kind of the AI boom here, we were thinking about these types of things back in the BDD days and things like that. And it's interesting that when we talk about the problem now, the problem is very, the problem definition is peppered with AI terms. And I think like now the problem is actually far greater because of those types of things. So a lot of the things that you say about, the issues around vibe coding, those types of things, they magnify the problem, which, like you say, vague requirements and things like that we previously had. It's just magnified so much more because of the additional complexity that vibe coding and these types of agents can bring along as well.
Yeah, like as engineers, if we had a gap in requirements documentation that seemed really obvious that would impact users, we would go and ask a clarifying question of a product manager, of somebody who's a stakeholder on the project. And we'd be a little annoyed by it, like, come on, we're mid-sprint, why didn't you think of this?
Yeah.
But we'd fill in that gap. The model just makes shit up, right? That's not a great outcome.
Yeah. Sometimes it is, but sometimes, a lot of the time it isn't. Yeah. So let's go ahead and kind of like take us through an example, kind of like Nearform rollout, I guess, of a BMAD project. I guess there are certain times when it's worked better, and certain times when maybe you've actually learned, it's not quite as good here. Talk us through, one of the most solid kind of BMAD rollouts that you guys have done.
Yeah, so it's sort of to date become the tool of choice for dev teams at Nearform who are looking to progress things in an AI native manner, probably alongside Kiro as the other strong contender. And all along, the observation I had was that it is not a great tool for actually kind of rapid prototyping and building, a functional prototype that you plan to throw away at the end, because the process is quite heavy.
Right.
It has actually made great leaps and bounds in V6's release, in terms of enabling you to say the sort of level of project that you're looking to build. And if you're looking to build a prototype, it simplifies the workflow. Haven't had enough hands-on time with it to form an opinion on if that's been successful, but traditionally rapid prototyping, still reaching for bolt.new or something. But where we're looking to actually build some sort of MVP and something that's actually shippable in the greenfield, we found it absolutely fantastic. I think there are probably some challenges to date in the brownfield, although it is the best thing I've come across for working in large brownfield code bases. Nonetheless, there are challenges with that. But for greenfield projects, it's been fantastic. And the way I kind of try to approach this, so my background is not in consulting. I'm relatively new to the world of consulting. I've mostly worked in product companies through engineering leadership roles. And I like to think about, rolling out these tool sets to teams of developers through the context of like developer empathy. So we talk a lot about customer empathy in the sales process, but I think developer empathy is actually a very important thing to recognize as an engineering leader. And it's like this, when you were hands on keyboard walking in the shoes of a developer, what stuff did you just hate? Like what drove you mad? And so like, writing infrastructure as code stacks only to have the CloudFormation deploy roll back 15 times in a row and having to go back and delete stuff manually, and just that drudgery I used to hate. Or, fixing an automation test that's blown up because a pixel moved 10 pixels or a button moved 10 pixels to the right in the middle of the night. Like that's really frustrating, not a good use of my time. Ugh. Even documentation. So all of those tasks, how can we introduce tooling into the AI development lifecycle, AI into the development lifecycle to make those things a lot less painful? So like what would developers really gravitate towards, in trying to automate away some of that pain? And to that end, something that I wonder is like, do developers actually really enjoy writing documentation and specs, right? Because this whole methodology is based on spending a lot of time with a markdown file. And I think some do, some don't. But as I think about how to roll out, both BMAD and a broader suite of sort of MCP enabled tools that are connected into an IDE, I like to think about the sort of developer archetypes that are going to be interacting with these systems and what are they actually getting from it? What makes their life like that bit easier?
Super interesting. And yeah, it's interesting actually. I remember giving I think it was the closing keynote at DevOps UK, and I gave a session and about what a future world will look like with AI native development. And they came up to me at the end of the session, and they had like worry on their face, going, you're projecting a future here where developers just don't code. Is that true? And I'm like, well, honestly, I think you'll be hard pressed to find anyone who will say at some code will always be a thing. And I while you'll have some skeptics that will say not in my lifetime, it's going to happen at some point. It's just a level of abstraction above where we are. The question is, I think, when. And I think it depends, I guess, whether a developer is so attached to the coding or whether they're attached to the creation, like the build, the complexity of the problem solving and the creation. And I always think people who care about the creation, the construction, almost the how I build this thing in terms of how I architect it, how I think about various things, integrating and building together. That's going to be there, and hopefully
that's not going away.
Yeah, hopefully we'll abstract ourselves on top of that file still, and we can still make have input into those discussions. But I think for people who are like fully attached to code, that's in my opinion certainly, and I think a lot of people's, it's absolutely going to be reduced and someday most likely.
Challenging position to hold, isn't it?
It is. It's a very hard
code as
thing,
an artifact is definitely becoming less important. That doesn't mean that the quality of the output of that artifact doesn't matter. In fact, all of the best practices that we followed all these years are just as important as before. And having code that is linted such that you can actually read it and maintain it is really important. And having code that is incredibly well structured is really important. And the art of selecting what dependencies that you're using, you definitely want to be picking the latest version of Next.js, as recent events have shown us. But the art of like actually picking what modules, dependencies, architecture that you're going to use becomes the part of the craft that becomes more important in my head. And the actual line by line writing and production of code is sort of the thing that becomes less. One of the funny things about Nearform is, as a business, we've always hired senior staff. So I think the average experience in the business runs about 8 years, but lots, 10, 15, 20 years of experience. And it feels like those types of developers are going to have a much more productive time in steering some of these tools, right? Like it's going to be interesting to see over the next couple of years what that does to the shape of general software engineering teams. One, really unfortunate artifact we've seen of this AI native era is probably the kind of reduction in hiring pipelines, and also what the future looks like for junior developers. It's become a bit of a challenging time, and that's something that probably bums me out a little bit.
Yeah, and I guess there's a lot of kind of like, the fear, uncertainty, and doubt here is quite high in terms of what does this mean for junior developers. But I guess kind of like my opinion almost on this is I guess senior developers are more likely to be able to naturally switch over because they just have that experience and they have that underlying knowledge. I think the path of a junior developer is just going to be different. I think they're going to have to learn different things. And arguably, I could almost say, well, actually, by being a junior developer, you're going to be naturally more AI native because that's the path you learn. And so we're going to probably have this switch over where the junior developers are actually going to be somewhat more reliant, but also more happy, more. They will choose to use AI probably with a lower level, with a lower bar than more of a senior developer. So they're probably jumping into it more. But that senior developer today certainly does have that kind of like more of that knowledge, particularly around when they're writing specs, what they want and why they know why they want it that way.
Yeah, and I'm even not as worried about this notion of all of a sudden teams just being seniors and the pipeline of junior talent drying up. I think the reality of market economics is that nobody's going to let that happen, and the need for junior team members is going to be very quickly solved by hiring pipelines and so on, that's going to have to be balanced at some point in the future. And there might be a minor reckoning, but we're still going to need junior developers that we grow into senior talent. Maybe that more progressive mindset of somebody who hasn't been doing this for as long is more open to the change that AI native brings, and actually it ends up being an advantage. Who knows, right?
Yeah, no, I very much agree. So we talked a little bit about specs there as well. I guess when we think about from the developer point of view, the developers are going to be potentially writing the specs, maybe manually, maybe through agents or LLMs. The specs ultimately will absolutely be consumed by agents. But we're at that funny crossroad where kind of like both the agent or both an LLM and an agent and a human need to read this and need to understand it, because one is generating code from it, the other one is trying to maintain it from the point of view of making sure the features are correct and well written, etc. Who would you say needs to be the almost like the primary stakeholder? Who's the person where this specification should be written for a person? And I guess a little bit of a comparison here, I guess, is when we write code today, we have two options. We either make it, the most performant, most effective code possible, which means we're writing for a maybe it's a JDK or the machine code that is the most performant, most effective possible. That makes it far less maintainable. So we very often make decisions to make something more maintainable because we feel, well, we're the ones who are trying to maintain this and read this as well. Let's make it most readable for us, and let the compilers and everything else deal with a lot of the efficiencies after the sake. So, who is this primary artifact, the spec written for, primarily?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And I like the sort of code optimization comparison. I also love that you had to get the JDK in there. Some of your roots are showing through here, Simon. That's great.
Yeah, my JDK grey hairs, yeah.
Yeah. I think that ultimately, for me at least, writing the specs for human consumption is absolutely vital, because that review phase is quite important. If you are writing outputs purely for the consumption of a model, you're probably not really reviewing what it is that's been generated. If you're generating a PRD off of a transcript and just blindly accepting it, in my eyes, you've probably missed the purpose of spec-driven development in the first place. And actually the honing of that spec, however much some developers may not enjoy, crafting Markdown, is actually the really important part of this process. In terms of the model being able to interpret what's been written, I actually don't know how much of a consideration that's been in my experience. Models are incredibly adaptable, for sure. If we're putting in a PDF-ified Gantt chart, we're probably going to have a bad time. That's not going to go well. But things like Mermaid.js syntax, which I've always done anyway, or even just the subset of web sequence diagram syntax, that type of thing in technical documentation is invaluable. If you've sort of come of age as a developer in the world of building specifications in Markdown on GitHub, you're going to have a great time. If you've come of age in the world of, Microsoft Word documents and diagrams scaffolded using those constructs in XML, which is ultimately what the Word format bakes down to, probably not going to have as good of a time. I found that, the kind of modern way that developers architect their documentation, models are just really good at reading, and that's a really nice coincidence.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And we kind of mentioned there a little bit about maintenance. I guess we're going to have the same issue with specs, right? How do we make sure that specifications don't become stale, that developers are continually upgrading the spec and it doesn't get out of sync? I guess when we think about BMAD specifications, the BMAD method, how do we make sure that this isn't turning into a maintenance hell, and that we don't get stale documentation that just sits there, nobody reads it, similar to kind of what we saw the PRD become?
I think there's this continuum, isn't there, in the world of spec-driven, between spec as source, as the kind of the first term, the spec as the baseline artifact that the code is generated off, such that you throw away the spec and get the exact same code artifact or very similar code artifact as a result when you regenerate your code, versus a more kind of spec first driven methodology, where the specs are essentially, they last for the life cycle of the epic or the feature or the task and then get thrown away. And so, tied back to that is this world of maintaining the documentation. And I feel like as the frameworks evolve, we will end up more in a world of spec as source, where the really important artifact is the spec, cascading all the way back to the product requirements document. But in the immediate term, we are definitely seeing some degree of like documentation rot and documentation going out of state or out of sync, a little bit stale. In BMAD specifically, I've seen this solved for a little bit through the ability to inject into the backlog new work items that might alter the course of development. And within that work log item in the backlog, you will also have a specific spec for the story that talks a little bit about the detailed implementation of that story and what we expect from it. Does that cascade back neatly to the PRD and architecture document if needed? Sometimes, but not always.
Yeah.
And that just feels like a direction of travel that eventually, PRD type requirements type documentation will wind up also being kept in sync. Feels like that's the way that the tooling is headed, but we're certainly not there yet.
Yeah. And it's interesting when we talk about it, because there's like, you talk about tooling there, and that's the way the tooling is heading. And I guess there's like any major kind of change to our industry, there's different things that need to change. There's tooling, there's practices and process, there's the human cultural side. And like DevOps is a great example of people sometimes initially over rotating on the tooling, but actually coming back to realize actually this is a team, a process, a cultural change that we need to address first. I guess BMAD, let's ask the same question of BMAD. Is this fundamentally a technological problem, or is this a cultural practice that we need to change?
I think it's a mixture of both, but it sort of starts out in the world as a change in culture. So what it sort of does is it forces you up front to expose a lot of the assumptions that might exist within a software project. Because, as we discussed earlier, if you're unearthing these discoveries and these assumptions as development is ongoing, results may vary. And so it's very important to have a well-aligned piece of documentation with all of the stakeholders that talks about what exactly it is that you're building. And to me, that's, a pure cultural change. There are also kind of technical practice changes coming about as a result of the use of many of these SDD tools, BMAD included. In particular, probably the worst technical change that I've seen is probably the transition from teams to sort of the sole contributor. And that's one of the things we are most focused on trying to solve for, is how do you scale a spec-driven framework to an entire team of developers rather than an individual contributor that is taking on the role of DevOps plus front-end engineer plus back-end engineer plus, the list goes on. I think that's almost, not a great way to be building within the enterprise, and we need to better solve for that collaboration piece. And although right now the challenges are purely technical, it feels like ultimately, it's a cultural, it impacts the culture because, you're expecting an individual contributor to be able to wear all these hats. The limitation is purely technical. It is that right now we are mixing, the work of the back end and the front end engineer in our decomposed task lists that are output of a lot of these spec-driven tools, assuming full stack engineering. But in reality, we could be aligning these tasks to individual roles and have people contribute. So I am optimistic of the future for the sort of more collaborative culture that spec-driven will bring. But the tooling right now just needs to catch up.
Yeah, and I love the phrase you used there as well, where it's like I think you mentioned forcing function, which I think problems with a culture change in terms of the way we go about building software or doing anything in the space of tech. You often have all the desire you want in trying to make that change, but ultimately it's the tooling, which is the forcing function, that encourages and ensures people are actually taking those steps. And I think it's the tooling that helps train us to make those cultural kind of steps to ensure we actually follow that. And over time, we'll probably do that without even thinking, but it's that transition whereby the tooling can really help teams grow fast. And I think I really liked what you're talking about with the collaboration and the teams. And I guess I'd love to ask a couple of questions. First of all, maybe go into more depth on specs, and then I'd love to kind of like understand at what point does that make it too heavyweight. So why don't we start with specs? This is a cultural change to actually, get people to sit down and write those specifications and think out what they need to put into those specifications. I guess at what depth do we need detail about every aspect of a project, whereby that's going to maybe we overthink things, or it actually starts slowing us down versus helping us. Where's the right level for detail, I guess, in those specifications?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think in the world of startups, the idea of overly verbosely specifying what it is that you want to build is, almost a sort of a bad word, right? The super detailed spec can slow teams down. I feel like the right size spec problem is something that is another challenge with the tooling right now. We talked earlier a little bit about rapid prototyping not being a great fit for vibe coding, bug fixing not being a great fit for vibe coding. And right now, it feels like the sort of the scale of the specs that frameworks like BMAD produce can be quite excessively verbose and heavy. That's one of the things that we're looking to try and trim. Because not only are we looking to right size the specs for human context, right, but we're also limited in how much the model can comprehend, and the quality of outputs will go down the more and more the context window we take off with just specs, right? So that right size question is probably one of the most important things for these frameworks to get right. It feels to me like BMAD is the closest approximation of that I've seen to date, but it's not perfect. It does some really clever things around very lengthy documents like PRDs and architecture documents called sharding, which is super clever. So what it will do is split up a requirements document such that the functional requirements per epic are split, and then a architecture document such that components are split, such as front end and back end. And only subsets of those sharded documents are included in the context window when interacting with the model. And it's some of the cleverness like that that makes me think this is like the best approximation right now of what spec-driven looks like in providing the best possible honed context to a model. In theory, every line of spec helps the model, and it's really just about optimizing for context window, but in reality, that can become excessive. So like, it's one of the most important things, I think, to optimize for that length of a spec, and how big can it be before it starts hurting rather than being helpful. That's where these frameworks, I think, are going to longer term help us.
Yeah, and oh gosh, this resonates so much. I'm literally doing something right now with a whole bunch of kind of like spec style documentation, markdown files that are kind of like sharing core security practices and OWASP practices, and we're talking like 80 different files of best practices and policies of how to write secure software. Now, if we was to throw all of that directly at an LLM and say, right, do a code review here, there's just too much context for it to kind of like hold in and say, yeah, I'm gonna do all of this, and I'll do it very, very carefully. But the more I'm thinking about it, and the way I'm approaching this, maybe even as a code review, is to perhaps say, well, let's actually try and target various flows whereby sharding's a great way of saying it, actually. I'm looking at very specific areas. Maybe start off with authentication. Let's do a code review for authentication across this massive app, because otherwise you've got so much context and you've got so much code that you're trying to look at. It's not going to do a good job, I don't think.
Really interesting to see is like how much. So right now, a lot of the logic for how this is sharded is sat on a framework called BMAD. But if you go up the chain, right? So like if you look at the IDE and how it selects the most relevant piece of context to send to the foundation model, then you go up the chain again and you look at the foundation model as it reasons while completing a coding task and decides which bits of context to pull, how much we can align on, standardized specs that we're using to develop. We have some constructs now like agents.md, but then we get into, do we use .cursor rules or a project constitution or Claude.md. Right now, it's a little bit of the Wild West. It was nice to see the MCP standard get released into an open source foundation, but there's a lot more to be done on standardizing on this sort of base building blocks of specs across model vendors and across IDEs. And it's sort of exciting to me to see how much of the sort of techniques and terminology that we use in the framework land right now, all the way up here, is going to eventually cascade down into foundation model vendors and also IDE tool vendors. So yeah, shout out to the vendors of tools here. Like let's get a bit of standardization going. The more the better, right?
Absolutely, and I think that's the key as well, because you'll get people like using, whether it's IDEs or agents across a company, even wanting the same style, and that the agent agnostic approach is going to be so important for this. So you mentioned about startups. I guess the startup culture of really valuing speed and delivery and experimentation as well. Is this the wrong approach then for a startup, or do you feel like there's a path where BMAD can be used there as well?
$1 million question. And like, where on the spectrum does this belong within a startup as well?
Yeah.
I think the sort of, the world of the vibe coder is going to find this very frustrating, right? Because it's going to slow them down. And the idea of having gone from seeing outputs in 20 minutes to an hour to seeing outputs at the end of a 5-6 hour documentation session will be inherently frustrating to somebody who's used to, in a really low diligence way, just prompting their way to a really cool application. But for me, at least, the penny drop moment was when the quality reflected the fact that, that slight increase in effort was put in. And so, when I was able to build something in, let's say, 2 days of spec authoring and iterating through a backlog, that I felt I understood and it felt like an artifact that would have taken me a month to produce otherwise, and was probably better code than I would have written. That's when the penny really dropped for me. And a repository with linted code that had 200, 300, 400 unit tests, automation tests, an architecturally separate front end and back end, infrastructure as code, like just real wow factor. And I think that any startup that isn't leveraging this build methodology is going to find it very hard to compete in a world where, the vast majority of, for example, Y Combinator startups are using AI tooling to build much, if not all, of their code. A statistic I don't want to misquote, but some, incredibly high percentage of startups in Y Combinator using tools like this. It just gives that sort of competitive edge, and the world of building product just looks so different now because anybody can show up with a vibe coded prototype and show something shiny to investors, but actually transitioning it into something that would scale to the first even 500 or 1,000 users is a very different question. And I feel like Spec-Driven is like the methodology for doing this.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. When I see spec-driven approaches and I see kind of more prompt-driven approaches, you almost like start looking at a prompt-driven approach being a very prototype style way of doing things. I've even known someone to start with a prompt-driven approach, and they send their kind of like Claude logs or whatever it is over and say, look, build me a spec based on these prompts. From my prompts where my intents are. You can see from the code that's been generated what has been built, what I'm happy with. Build a spec that represents this. And I guess kind of like, do you feel like that if you were to go fully vibe in like prompts without building a spec, do you feel like that would be like a strong limiter for people who actually want to go much further, much closer to production, those who want to scale AI within their organizations?
As you've probably gathered, like that's kind of the framework of how I think of things that have purely been prompted. Like that's not to say that you couldn't construct a perfect prompt that actually encapsulates all of the context from your specs and just perfectly right sizes your context window such that it's built, task by task, a bunch of different smaller stories in just, very well crafted prompts. That's definitely possible. But the methodology of spec-driven with the combination of a framework makes you more likely to be successful.
Yeah.
What's also interesting is is spec-driven what the future of AI native engineering looks like? Like, I'm not actually that dogged on the fact that it is. I'm not completely convinced. It feels as though Cursor in particular has been slow to adopt a lot of the primitives and instead gone through their recent release with plan mode feels like a spec similar to spec-driven or spec-driven compatible way of operation, but it's not exactly that. So like, it feels like the best approximation right now of how to work with these models, this spec-driven methodology, and also the BMAD framework itself. But that's not to say that, next year that's what things are going to look like. If I've learned one thing in the world in the kind of whirlwind that's been the last 9 months, it is that my crystal ball is inherently faulty and I will make terrible. Who knows?
Yeah. The crystal ball will be. I saw an 8-ball the other day where it's an LLM. It's an LLM implemented 8-ball, which is like, oh yeah, everything's going in the future. It's the crystal
Does it
ball
by
will
any chance repeatedly say
You're absolutely right. So when we think about how LLMs, typically are kind of like better with the more structured specs, with kind of like clear requirements. When we think about those specifications or those systems that are poorly specified, what do they become? Do they become something which just holds technical debt, or are they now a liability because of the way an LLM is essentially gonna implement that and make assumptions?
Yeah, it's an interesting kind of question, isn't it? Like, what becomes of technical debt? Do we have this new thing that is spec debt or requirements debt, or inadequate requirements? Because when you think about a tech debt, surely should at least fade into the background, because it's now easier to tackle backlogs of tech debt through agentic coding, right? The sort of drudgery of, well, actually, it doesn't feel like drudgery sometimes. It's really rewarding, but the art of like eliminating tech debt is now much easier to go after with an agentic coding system typically. So does that become really important when you can solve for tech debt much easier? And in fact, it's actually something that's not really aligned to what you wanted to build that becomes the problem. So like poorly defined requirements, does it become harder after going through 3-4 days worth of spec-driven development where you suddenly have this 20,000-30,000 line repository? Is it actually harder to recover from the fact that you missed some requirements along the way? And is there flexibility sufficient in the workflow to be able to make up for that? Certainly some of the techniques I've tried have been things like injecting new backlog items to the end of a backlog to try and recover, and still following the spec-driven methodology rather than sort of failing to vibe coding, which is definitely a temptation, but following the methodology to sort of steer towards the desired output. It's definitely tricky. The sort of verbosity as well in that kind of requirements documentation artifact. Like, I know the Kiro team are doing loads of really interesting research at the moment on what makes a like really good, well-defined, structured requirements document through, I think, the use of like formal methods to ensure that the requirements are well formed, and that they complete, and that the gaps are actually identifiable by the model as well.
Yeah, and I guess the goal here of BMAD, when we think about agents as they are today. Agents are becoming more and more autonomous. Are we trying to make them more autonomous through things like specifications and through BMAD methods, because that allows us to create a more detailed brain dump of what we're thinking? Or is it actually, are we still aiming for that very assisted back and forth chat style flow whereby it just makes it safer because we're giving it the guardrails it needs? Is there a kind of like a North Star that we're trying to get to, or are both very applicable?
Yeah, I think it's a bit of both. Ugh, I need to get off my fence, don't I?
If you was to choose one though, Cian.
I refuse. It's funny. Like, backlog decomposition for me feels like the place where there's a little bit of room now to speed up with the sort of kind of safety we've injected and guardrails we've injected into some of these frameworks. So like the iteration of an architecture document and a requirements document, that feels like a pretty important stage to still have a human in the loop. But when you've decomposed a backlog and reordered it to your heart's content, and you feel like the stories that an agent is going to go after one by one with a new context window for each one is in good shape, I'm not sure that me sitting there and trusting every single command that the model suggests I run is necessarily a great use of my time, when I can, run the agent in a sandbox and force it between each story to git commit, git push. And if it decides to rimraf/star, that's okay by me because I have everything in Git and it's in a container and who cares, right? You see all the memes of folk vibe coding and seeing it rimraf their entire directory -rf. That becomes less of a problem when you've got sufficient guardrails and you're operating in a nice sandboxed VM and so on. And so it just feels like sat there iterating through every single story, maybe less useful. I'd love to be able to accelerate through a bunch of stories and just review the output of epics maybe. And so you get towards more of that autonomy. When it comes to, as I said, that earlier phase of actually writing the specs, authoring the specs, aligning on the specs, I feel like there's less room for autonomy right now. But if we were able to also make that highly autonomous, like where do we end up? Are we actually back to vibe coding somehow?
Yeah.
I don't know.
It kind of like relies a lot on trust, right? Because if we don't have trust, we just plain don't have autonomy, because the trust is that piece in the culture that allows us to allow the AI agents to stretch those legs and run as fast
again,
as
right? It's like higher degree enable you to go after CI/CD and then
Yeah. So does BMAD? I guess BMAD changes that model then when we think about trust in terms of, does it provide us with more trust, and maybe we kind of like lean a little bit more into, I guess, the quality of AI output, and how specifications can provide that greater quality, because it's providing those guardrails, and as a result, knowing if those guardrails can be, whether there's automation in the validation and things like that, so that things can be raised to us to say, no, this is actually going against the things that we've said in the spec. We can not just recognize we know there's higher quality here, but we then have greater trust. Is that a path where we can raise the autonomy bar?
Yeah, I think that is exactly the lever that we need to be able to make the transition in autonomy, is being able to trust the outputs of the agent. And so, like, if in the short term it looks like on a per context window, per story basis we're reviewing outputs, so be it. But the more that the sort of quality metric is pushed further to the right, the more that we can afford that autonomy, and the more that we can afford to accelerate. And so I think what will get very interesting is, as we transition, as models are writing more and more tests to cover what it is that they've done. It's funny, the same tricks reign true, like TDD and so on. The more that models are able to actually test their outputs and prove that what they claim is working is in fact truth, through a completely separate artifact to it just interpreting the code, the more that we can trust that autonomy. And it's the traditional software engineering techniques that we've always used to build trust in an artifact and build trust in the deployment of an artifact, just being used by agents. Like, I do sometimes wonder, is there a world where there's some new construct that models use to test the validity of code that we don't traditionally do in a software development lifecycle, that can be used here? Maybe that's where the research goes. I don't know. The Kiro folks, again, shout out to them, have probably done the most in this space with their, what do they call them? Checks, I think. But they have a new, testing methodology that checks for completeness in a way that's not TDD and is not BDD, but is something different.
Yeah, and it's funny when we talk about TDD, and when we think about specs. And I remember in the early days of Tessl, when we were looking at what goes into a spec and how should it be phrased. What I found like immediately very interesting was how, well, if you were to write down a capability in a specification, you can think about that in two ways. You can think about that as, this is something I want the application to do, but also, just slightly written differently, it can be written as a test. You can say, when this happens, I want you to provide this back, and that it actually turns it into, just a slight rephrasing turns it into actually a test-driven development style approach, where actually your specification is a list of things that you want to be true, essentially test cases. So I guess what came first, the chicken or the egg here? What should come first in the spec, the code, or rather the capability, or the test?
That requirements writing style, EARS, is that what it's called? EARS requirements, is setting you up quite nicely for a specification of what a test to subsequently validate that requirement could be. And so it feels like that is vastly more important than, I don't know, your dump from your brainstorming session earlier on. So actually getting a succinct statement of what that requirement is and being able to use it as a testable artifact, highly valuable.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll be in a world where a Playwright automation test is written to validate a piece of functionality purely off of observation of the produced interface plus that statement with no insight into the code. The code is a black box, and the methodology is, here's the interface, here's the requirement, prove that this actually works, model, off you go.
Yeah, and it's just a LLM as a judge style, just trying to look at what's been created. Yeah, absolutely. And I think actually there are several papers that actually show that is a very valid way of running evals and actually very, very accurate as well. Yeah, cool. I guess why don't we wrap up with kind of like a little bit more on some of the things that Nearform have done. I guess you've run a number of experiments, certainly around BMAD and SDD, and I think you're from talking with a large number of people, I think you're probably from a consultancy point of view, definitely the group that have jumped in most with this kind of thing. So I'd love to kind of hear what are some of the most interesting experiments, I guess, that you've played around with and you've seen.
Yeah, we've definitely gone hell for leather. And so I suppose some of the kind of challenges that we found in rolling out a framework like BMAD to a team of people, since that's how we tend to operate, have forced us to sort of experiment a little bit with, how we overcome that. And so I've done a little bit of spiking on how to codify some of the roles of our team within BMAD. A colleague of mine, Luca, shout out to Luca, is doing incredible things at the moment in forcing the backlog generated from BMAD to be able to sync with an issue management system like GitHub Issues, and also being able to orchestrate these workflows, not just locally on a developer's machine, but through something like a GitHub Actions workflow. So a super cool way of running spec-driven development tasks through a more shared interface where the sort of work log is visible by all members of the team through a web browser rather than an IDE. Helps with that kind of going parallel as well. And that's been most of our experimentation throughout the kind of latter half of 2025. And so what we're now toying with as a business is, do we just embrace chaos and let a bunch of really clever people drive their own experiments, which yes, absolutely, that's the open source way. And in 2026 the hope is that we'll be able to harvest from a bunch of these really clever ideas a more kind of unified Nearform way of delivering at scale, overcoming some of the challenges that we have with the core framework. Does that wind up a module within BMAD? Do we roll our own framework? Do we contribute back to BMAD? That very much remains up for grabs. But it feels like an area where we're going to need to contribute something. The hope would be something in the open source domain, to try and solve, in particular for going parallel across multiple teams. That's been the big area of focus.
Yeah, super interesting. And to be honest, I love working with you guys, and I can't say enough nice things about you and the team. For folks who want to learn more about, or first of all, keep up to date with some of the great things that Nearform are doing, or reach out to work with you, what's the best ways of getting in contact and learning more about Nearform?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, great place to start, nearform.com. The jobs board is up there. In terms of what we've been experimenting with Spec-Driven, I'm the worst on our blog. I need to written nothing. I think I've written more on your blog than I have on my own at the moment. But shameless plug, come follow me on LinkedIn. I tend to, post fairly techie stuff on the world of Spec-Driven development pretty sporadically. Our own Nearform Insights account on LinkedIn also posts a bunch of great content. A couple of my colleagues post a lot, retweeted by the main account in the world of Spec-Driven. And so we're a pretty active bunch on LinkedIn, and that tends to be where we talk the most about our experiments in Spec-Driven and what's working and also what's not working. We're a pretty open book when things don't go well as well.
Yeah. Sounds amazing. Well, Cian, I think we've got about 2 to 3 hours of content in somehow around 50, just over over 50 minutes.
Oh.
So we did well. We did well.
Yeah,
Cian,
well, thanks so much for having me, Simon.
oh, it's been an absolute pleasure, Cian. I really enjoyed the conversation, and thank you very much for bringing all of your and Nearform's expertise and experience to share with our listeners. So appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. I'm sure we'll chat again next time I'm over in London, which I've no doubt will be sometime in January.
Oh, wonderful. We'll see you there. And I hope everyone enjoyed that episode. Tell us what you thought, and speak to you soon, and see you on the next, or tune into the next episode rather. Thank you very much. Bye for now.